Hello everyone, and welcome to today's video. We're going to talk about one of Dark Cloud's lesser known appearances. When Dark Cloud was first in development, Sony and Level 5 marketed the game in every way that they could find. It was Level 5's first game, and it had to be an impressive new title for the PlayStation 2. There's many demos, magazines, and events that all featured Dark Cloud. Despite their efforts in Japan, it did end up with much lower than expected sales until it was released overseas. Jump Festa 2001 was one of the many events that Dark Cloud was featured at. It's one of the events that most fans haven't heard of since it took place in Japan and there wouldn't have been much international coverage. It was also still in the early days of gaming for many of us. Like many other events, they had set up Dark Cloud demo kiosks for guests to play the demo in, and with this they brought a lot of specially designed props and advertisements that were never seen again. The most impressive of these was the giant Dark Genie statue that they brought in. Standing tall above the crowds, this beautiful statue must have drawn in the much wanted attention to Dark Cloud. Pictured in front of the statue is Kentaro Motomura, and like usual, he was in attendance to help advertise and answer questions. The event was held at Makuhari Messe in Chiba on December 23rd and 24th in 2000, despite the event saying it was in 2001. Apparently, the genie had some moving parts too. It's hard to tell from this picture, but it was probably the head and arms that were able to move around. Right now, these are the last pictures and best resolution possible that can be found for this event. If larger images exist, then it's likely that they've been lost to time and went unsaved by the Internet Archive. Maybe someone in Japan still has photos of that day. They brought even more to this event, including figures of several monsters and characters like Ruby, the Skeleton, and a smaller version of the Dark Genie. There's many other known pictures of statues in the same style like Tuan, however the pictures of those have also been lost to time. Hopefully these still exist somewhere and we can get a better look at them someday, but the giant Dark Genie statue itself was probably destroyed a long time ago. Also at this event, Kentaro was interviewed by PlayStation World. They mostly asked him about the Georama, the player's thoughts, and the dungeon mechanics. The randomized dungeon system was a part of the game that some players had trouble figuring out. They had to get used to the many functions like locking on to fight. This was also more important in the Japanese version since combat was less about quick combination attacks and was slower single strikes. If you've only ever played the US or PAL version of Dark Cloud, then you've played the upgraded version of the game. Besides the combat and build-up tab, there's countless differences from the Japanese version. The bosses, many parts of the world, and game mechanics were originally much different. Some of the more interesting differences include Lisaya, who used to have a much different boss fight, where she had shields that you had to destroy first. The pier in front of the waterfall in Marataki also isn't there, and many of the weapons are also missing, such as the 7th Heaven, Angel Gear, and much more. If you've never played the Japanese version, it's definitely worth trying out. It's a much different game and more difficult in some ways. Thankfully, many quality of life and gameplay improvements were made for the international versions. Later in the interview, Kentaro said he would read through forums and similar on the internet where fans wrote about their impressions of the game. It was clear that the randomized dungeons and Georama had become a favorite for many players. Leveling up weapons was another favorite. Although one more fact about the Japanese version is that there was no build-up tab that told you the stats you needed to build up to the next weapon. The other developers probably read through a lot of comments that players made too. It's likely that's what led to at least some of the changes they made for the international release. The interviewer asked him, what is the most memorable game for Mr. Motomura? He immediately answered, it's Wizardy. I like games where users find their own way to play, not just let them play. Dark Cloud shared this philosophy with their randomized dungeons, the Georama, and the variety of weapons and characters that you could use. Wizardy is an RPG series that was a source of inspiration for many other series like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest as well. Wizardy evolved a lot over time, and one of the most well-known titles was Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord. It introduced many new RPG elements, like parties with fighting classes, and it was one of the first Dungeons & Dragons style games that had color graphics. You start off in town, where you can create a party of 6 characters and can choose from many classes that had various abilities. You could even choose parties of good and evil. Then you descend into a dungeon maze with random encounters. That's what Kentaro liked. There was a lot of variety and customization, there was always more to explore, and you could play the game in many different ways. So you can see how Wizardy had at least some inspiration for the ideas used in Dark Cloud. Level 5 put the Georama into the game to give players the freedom to build how they liked. Although it ended up requiring the player to place specific items exactly onto buildings, you could still be creative with their placement and the environment. They also had many characters to choose from in the dungeons. You could play as whoever you wanted, and could build up whichever weapons that you liked. The players were given at least some choice to play their own way. Each character does have something special about them. Even though their backstories are short, they have a lot of personality in their designs. They match their home villages, and it makes you want to continue imagining what their story is. They went on to talk about the Georama and what made the production staff put so much effort into it. He answered, "It's an RPG, of course. The Georama became an important part of gameplay and advancing the story. They wanted everyone to have fun playing through the story and dungeons while collecting parts at the same time, so you could create your own city." He watched players at the events he went to and saw each person had a different placement of objects and buildings. He says there are as many styles as there are players, and it was encouraging for the production side when they saw how each player liked to build their own way. When asked if this is the real thrill of Dark Cloud, he said yes, and described the game as an RPG with a lot of systems and side content to play with. It's a game that you might have a lot to learn about at first, but once you overcome the initial learning curve, you'll appreciate it much more. He also told Kentaro about the game being compared to Zelda, which happened on forums and in the media. He said in that sense, it's a great honor. Dark Cloud was called the Zelda Killer a few times, and this claim was even featured in an independent PlayStation 2 magazine. Although some parts may have a similar feel, and Tuan looks like he could be a Zelda character, they're obviously much different games. Zelda was exclusive with Nintendo in their systems, and it already had a very strong fanbase. Gameplay-wise, they did have some in common, but not enough to be competitors. Both of them are RPGs with dungeons, monsters, and their own adventures, but they each have unique worlds, stories, and RPG side content. The last part of the interview that I haven't mentioned yet was about some of the difficulties he had while working on the game. He said his main problem was that he was far from Level 5's headquarters, and he had to fly around with new versions of the game a lot. It had a production period of about 2 years, although he did like to work with the hardware and said it was very responsive. What he researched the most during development was creating natural looking expressions with CG, and for its time it really showed, for the characters, the water, and the gameplay environment overall. There's few PS2 games that had as good of a color palette that Dark Cloud had, and the same can be said for how good the effects look. Not just for the water, but the wind blowing, fire, and even the smaller details like movement of the player's clothes. I think that's something they put extra emphasis on when they showed it off at events. Not just at Jump Festa, but also at the following events they did in Europe and the US. This aspect of the game was very underrated, and if you compare it to other PS2 games that came out much later, you can easily tell the difference in quality. One last thing to mention would be the PS1 Pure Plus Volume 7 disc that was released around the same time as this event. Kentaro answered some more questions of interest on it, and again emphasizes how they tried to make the world immersive, detailed, and how the game had the ability to change on its own, from the random dungeons to smaller features like time passing. I released a full translation of the interviews and the art on the disc in another video I made. I'll show you the most relevant parts of it here, but if you want to see the rest, I've put a link to that in the description.
悪いやつを倒すだけではなくって実際壊してしまった世界を主人公が自らの手で作り変えていく再生させていくことができるという、そういった部分が世界を作る RPG というゆえんでして、具体的に言うと、RPG とかで街がたくさんあってそこには宿屋とかがいろいろあったりするんで、決められた街が必ず存在するんですが、このゲームの場合は、そのユーザーが作る過程において、家とかですね、木や川といったもの自体も自分が好きなように世界を構築することができるんで、自分だけの町や村が作れて、でなおかつそれはもう世界を作るということにつながるという部分で、世界を作る RPG と、プレイステーション2でよく使われているエモーションっていう部分で、情緒という部分ですけども、そういった部分を結構気を使ってですね、そういった時間の流れで背景がリアルタイムに変化していったりですね、水の揺らめきとか炎の揺らめきとか、あと風の処理で風によってその主人公とかの衣服がなびくといった部分も力を入れてますんで、割と本当にある意味環境的な部分もですね再現されている世界観だと思います。一番大きいところは、自分だけの世界を作れる RPG というふうにですね、やっぱりここはどこどこの町っていうカテゴリーがあって、こっちに行けば武器屋があってこっちに行けば何屋があるっていうような決まったマップってものにも存在しないんで、例えばダンジョンのすぐそばに道具屋を置けば買い物楽だよねっていう場合は、ユーザーがそういうふうに作ることができますし、で緑がいっぱい好きな人はその緑をたくさん植えたりですね、そういったような世界づくりが、ユーザーができるというふうですね。であとダンジョンシーンとかでもダンジョン自体が自動生成型の、マップ マップ生成されるダンジョンでして、入るたびに全く違うダンジョンや、敵の配置、アイテムの配置が変わるんで、全く新しいプレイ何度も楽しめると、そういった要素があります。
That's about everything I could find that covers Dark Cloud at Jump Festa in 2001. I wish we would have been able to see more, but when searching around, it seems that Dark Cloud was overshadowed by other contenders like One Piece, Yu-Gi-Oh, and similar. There's many other events around the world that featured Dark Cloud, so I plan to cover more of those. If you're interested in seeing more, please subscribe and give this video a like. This is Shaztopia. Have a wonderful day.